And again, welcome everybody. My name is Bronwyn Strong. I'm the program director for the Natural History Society of Maryland. I want to welcome you to the April meeting of the Fossil Club. We're excited to have to be learning together, and I will turn it over to Mason to introduce our speaker for tonight.
All right, so we're very happy to have Jack Cooper here from all the way across the pond. He is a PhD researcher at Swansea University, and he is also funded by the Fisheries Society of the British Isles, and he is part of the Pimiento Research Group, which studies the biodiversity over time of sharks and the functionality of sharks. And he's going to be talking to us about Megalodon and how it looked and how it lived, and I'm really excited, and you should be too. So. Without further ado, thanks for being here, Jack, and take it away.
Thanks, Mason. I'll just quickly share my screen so you can all see that. Is that all good for everyone? All good?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Right, so thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. As Mason mentioned, my name is Jack, and I'm here to talk to you about all things Megalodon. So let's just get right into it. But before I do that, I'll give just a very quick, brief intro, or a wee bit about me, as we would say over here. I was born and raised in Scotland, and much like a lot of kids, perhaps including many of you, I was in a wee dinosaur phase at an early age, that at about the age of 6 shifted gears towards sharks. And that was particularly when I came across the BBC Walking with Sea Monsters documentary, in which zoologist Nigel Marven would time travel to meet CGI versions of these ancient marine predators. And in one of those sections, he went and dived with a megalodon. And to a wee 6-year-old, that was mind-blowing, because this huge monster was not only the size it was, but had actually existed, and not in the too far distant past either. So I was hooked ever since, and following that, I pursued a degree in evolutionary biology at the University of St Andrews, where I not only got to take my first ever classes related to paleontology, but I was able to develop a great wee support bubble, both in the classroom and amongst the many, many people I got to meet in my halls of residence, many of whom I'm still in touch with via Zoom calls to this day, and some of them are actually here right now, which is pretty great. During my time in St Andrews, I actually took up 2 internships in South Africa, where I actually got to work for ecotourism and conservation companies that took tourists out to sea in order to cage dive with living great white sharks in their natural habitats. My first trip there was in 2017 to a place called Hansby, which is also known as the great white shark capital of the world. And not only did I get to meet my first ever great whites there, but I got to bear witness to a very unique biological event there, in which a couple of killer whales actually came into the bay and killed a few great white sharks there. I was lucky enough to get to be part of a dissection of one of the sharks they killed, and my experiences getting to witness such an event was so breathtaking that 1 year later, I was crazy enough to go back to South Africa to see the sharks, this time to a place called Mussel Bay, in which the sharks were even more active around the boat, and got to hang out by a wee island named Seal Island, so they could go and prey on all the seals there. And getting to meet these iconic animals up close only further fueled a desire to study the extinct sharks. So I took up a paleobiology degree at the University of Bristol, where again, I got to meet some great like-minded people, both in our choice of career, being that we were all into fossils, and also, more importantly, our choice of pub, as we all had very similar drinking tastes. And oddly enough, not only did I get to study paleontology in full force there, but my interest in Megalodon actually came full circle, as I got to study that very same animal for my project there, which I'll be talking about in more detail shortly. And as Mason was introducing, right now I'm a PhD student at Swansea University, and I'm funded by the Fisheries Society of the British Isles. My project is the functional diversity of sharks through time, which is essentially, we're trying to understand the diversity of various functional traits that sharks had. Those would be traits such as body size or diet, so we can understand how sharks might have reacted to various environmental changes or extinctions in the past, and that might well inform us how they might react to the threats they currently face today. My supervisor is Dr. Catalina Pimiento, who is a world-leading expert in fossil sharks and especially Megalodon. You're going to be seeing her work popping up a lot in this talk. And because I work under her, I'm also part of the Pimiento research group. And our goals are simply to understand the extinction mechanisms of big, large marine animals, and particularly sharks, so that we can inform various conservation groups, such as those I worked for in South Africa. So now, since I'm going to be talking to you for about the next 40 to 45 minutes on Megalodon, this is just a quick outline to show you what I'll be going through, and we'll be returning to it to check off each section as we go along. I'll start with a very brief discussion on what we've actually managed to learn about Megalodon from its fossils, since this is a fossil group, with some emphasis on how we calculate Megalodon's size and some of the issues that come with that, before I spend the second half of the talk giving a bit more detail into my work involving 2D and 3D reconstructions. So without further ado, let's get to the main event. Megalodon fossils, or specifically their teeth, are some of the most iconic fossils in paleontology. And when you look at the picture here, there's a very obvious reason why. That tooth is from the collection of the University of Bristol and is being compared against my hand in that photo. And as you can see, they're virtually the same size, which is a clear indication that this belongs to an enormous animal. These fossils are dated to the Miocene and the Pliocene epochs, which covers a time period of between 23 and 2.6 million years ago. And we've tried to identify the scientific name of Megalodon based on how similar its teeth look to that of living sharks. As a result of this, for many, many years, it was called Carcharodon megalodon as an ancestor or a direct ancestor to the modern great white shark. But we now know that this was not actually the case. Megalodon was actually part of its own separate extinct family to the great white, and as such has been given names such as Carcharocleus megalodon, or more recently Otodus megalodon. But the reasoning behind which names you choose is very, very convoluted. Even I struggle to get my head around it sometimes. So to make things simpler for everyone, myself included, I'm just going to simply refer to this shark as Megalodon from here on out. If you look at the map here, the blue and yellow circles mark areas around the world where Megalodon teeth have been found. And the first thing that springs to mind when you see this is that they've been found on every single continent except Antarctica. And this clearly indicates that this shark lived in every ocean all around the world. But some specific sites are actually a bit more telling about Megalodon's life history other than where they lived. One of my favorite examples is the Gatun Formation in Panama. It's dated to the Miocene about 10 million years ago and was actually the basis of Catalina's first ever paper because it's significant for having a lot of very tiny Megalodon teeth, indicating that it was the first known nursery site of this shark. For those who don't know, nursery sites are very, very common for modern day sharks, such as the great white. And they're essentially areas in which parent sharks will drop off their babies so that baby sharks can grow to reasonable sizes with plenty of food and also protection from predators. And the evidence that Megalodon was using this same behavioral technique suggests that they lived very similar lifestyles to many modern day sharks. And since the Gatun Formation was discovered in 2010, there have been 4 more nursery sites found of Megalodon just last year. both from the Miocene and the Pliocene. And studies of both the smallest teeth in those nurseries and more recently Megalodon's growth rate have found that Megalodon babies were born at about 2 meters long. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's the biggest baby shark that we know of any species. And that incredibly large size strongly indicates that this shark gave birth to live young. But once Megalodon grew up and were able to leave the nurseries as adults, they could eat just about whatever they wanted, as they were almost certainly apex predators. In fact, occasionally you do get fossil remains of bones from animals such as whales that have been bitten by Megalodon, which are often, you can tell by serrated bite marks. And that already is quite scary to think about, that this shark was targeting living whales. Usually though, with trace fossils like this, it's impossible to tell if it was predation or scavenging. However, there's one particular remarkable fossil from the work of Stephen Godfrey, who I believe actually works in the Calvert Museum. And he has found evidence of whale bones that have been not only been bitten by Megalodon, but have evidence of healing over those wounds, which strongly indicates that the whale actually survived being bitten by Megalodon, perhaps only to die of an infection some 6 weeks later. And that to me is very strong evidence that this shark was a predator. One of the most unique things about Megalodon teeth, though, is that the work of a man called Dr. Humberto Ferron has actually been able to determine that, much like mammals and birds, Megalodon could actually control its own inner body temperature via countercurrent heat exchangers that would maintain heat in its most important organs, like its eyes or its brain, or its fins that helped it swim. And this is determined by oxygen isotopes, which, if the oxygen isotope number is different in the teeth to that of the surrounding rocks, that indicates that the temperature of the animal is actually different to that of its environment, suggesting that the shark could control its own temperature. This is an exceptionally rare adaptation in sharks that is only ever seen in species like the great white or the mako shark, and it brings a few neat ecological benefits. For example, it allows the shark to become more active and actually get bigger before hitting its metabolic limit, meaning that this very adaptation relating to body temperature may be the reason this shark got so big in the first place. And additionally, it allows the shark to occupy a wider range of temperatures in its habitat, which explains how it could live all over the world. And finally, it allows the shark to actually swim faster, so it can cover more ground when it's looking for food. And of course, one thing that we're very keen to find out is when Megalodon actually went extinct. Datings from the teeth have suggested that it went extinct by the end of the Pliocene, some 2.6 million years ago, and this was first calculated by Catalina. More recent work by Dr. Bobby Bozenecker down in South Carolina has tried to vigorously study the dating of many different Megalodon teeth and has suggested that perhaps it went extinct up to 1 million years earlier, some 3.6 million years ago. But regardless of when exactly Megalodon went extinct, the bigger question is, why did it go extinct? And the short answer is, we're not certain that there was actually one specific cause that ultimately did it. We know that because Megalodon could control its inner body temperature, that it was probably not climate related. Instead, it's far more likely to have been the work of a combination of biotic factors. And the work of Catalina in particular has suggested that it may have actually been caught up in an extinction event of marine megafauna, those being the largest individuals of various marine groups. And what she found was that there was actually sea level changes in the Pliocene that caused a massive reduction in coastal habitat area, so much so that extinction rates to marine megafauna were way, way higher than at any other time in the Cenozoic. And this would have been particularly bad for endothermic taxa like Megalodon and the whales that it was eating, which went into a massive diversity decline at the same time. And ultimately, this situation may have been made worse by reducing nursery site area and also by the emergence of possible competitors like the modern day great white shark. So in short, we've actually learned quite a lot about Megalodon just from its teeth. But naturally, if you go out fossil hunting and you find a Megalodon tooth, the first thing that springs to mind is just how big was the shark this tooth came from? And what was the maximum size this shark could possibly reach? Because we all know it was giant, but just how giant? Surprisingly, this is still up for debate depending on who you ask. There have been several different hypotheses as to what the biggest Megalodon size was. Kenzu Shimada, who works in Chicago, would tell you that the shark probably got no bigger than about 15 meters or around 50 feet. Work by Catalina, however, has used a data set of teeth from all over the world and has found maximum sizes of about 18 meters. And just last month, there was a new study by Victor Perez, who I believe is coming to give a talk here in a couple of months, actually, that used a very different method to the usual method and suggested that the shark could have been as big as 20 meters. And naturally, if any of you have seen the movie The Meg, that film portrays sharks of 25 plus meters, and that's over 80 feet. So no one has ever found any evidence to suggest that they were quite that big. So we can go ahead and safely say that's a slight exaggeration. But how do we actually calculate Megalodon's size when we only have its teeth to go off of? Well, to put it simply, the most accepted method for the last 20 or so years has come from the work of Kenzu Shimada. And what he does is he takes the measurement of the crown height of great white shark teeth. Those would be the height of the enamel or the slant. And what he does is he takes these heights for each individual tooth position and runs them in a linear equation against the total length of the shark, since the total length is known from the shark he's taking it from. And because great white sharks have similar looking teeth to Megalodon, he then extrapolates that same relationship to Megalodon. So essentially, it's the crown height of the teeth that is used in a very simple mathematical equation to get the length of our shark. But more recently, this method has actually come under a bit more scrutiny. For example, it was based on just 12 great white sharks, which nowadays would not be considered a particularly big sample size. And more recent work by Victor Perez has actually tried to apply those same equations, which, as I noticed, differ depending on the tooth position, to what's called an associated dentition of Megalodon, that being a tooth set that came from one single individual. And when he applied it to this associated dentition, this example here being a dentition that is used in the University of Florida, he found that the results, the total length results, were not that consistent. When we use the upper middle teeth, we get size of about 12 meters, which seems pretty reasonable. But the further back you go in the jaw, you get larger and larger size estimates. To the very back teeth, you end up getting sizes of 88 meters or 300 feet, which is a truly ridiculous and downright impossible size for this shark, basically suggesting there's quite a wide margin for error if you apply all of these equations to one dentition. Shimada has noted this recently and has suggested that we should focus more on upper anterior teeth, those being the teeth in the upper jaw and in the middle. And this is because they're the best correlated to total length in the great white. And that does make sense. It seems pretty reasonable. But others like Perez would argue that this perhaps might lead to underestimations. And again, is still based on only 12 great white sharks. And as I was mentioning earlier, just last month, there was a new study by Victor Perez that was published, and that actually used a very different method to the usual Shimada method. What Perez and his team did was they actually took the width of those same associated dentitions I was talking about. And what they do with this is they're able to understand the proportion of the width of each tooth in that dentition based on the individual tooth positions. And they can extrapolate the relationship between the two to a relationship with total length seen in a wide variety of sharks. and they can extrapolate that same relationship to individual teeth to get a size for Megalodon. And from that, they applied their relationship to the largest Megalodon tooth they could find and got a size of a whopping 20 meters or 65 feet long. Now, this is a very, very new method that has only just come out. So it remains to be seen if it will become the more accepted method in time. But it's a method I consider personally to be very robust because it's utilizing more than just one tooth from one species, and it's actually considering a proxy for the entire jaw width. But we will see what becomes of this and if future studies will take this on more. But no matter which estimate you use to get the total length of Megalodon, that it only tells you the total length and does actually not tell you the rest of Megalodon's body profile. For example, it doesn't tell you how big those fins were or the gills that it used to breathe. And that's where my work comes in, because essentially, if we have a 16-meter Megalodon, we want to understand how big some of its other body parts, like that dorsal fin, was. So this will bring us to the meat of the talk, where I will be discussing my work around Megalodon. And a 2D reconstruction was the basis of my master's project at Bristol, which was supervised by Catalina Pimiento and also Professor Mike Benton, who is a world-leading expert in dinosaurs and phylogenetics. Also collaborating with us was Dr. Humberto Ferron, who I mentioned earlier was the guy who could determine that Megalodon could control its own inner body temperature. And that's something I want you all to keep in mind because his work will be critically important going forward. Our aims for this project were very simple. Firstly, we wanted to determine if the great white shark was actually the best available analog to use for Megalodon, given their lack of direct relatedness, or if any other sharks perhaps were good analogs, or any at all for that matter. Once we knew that, we needed to understand the relationships the specific body parts have to total length in those sharks, and then use that to understand how big those body parts were in a 16-meter Megalodon. But before I go on explaining how we did that, there is a slight air of caution that needs to be said when going forward, reconstructing any extinct animal, but especially an extinct shark. Much like living sharks, Megalodon's skeleton was made entirely out of cartilage and therefore typically decomposes with the rest of the body after the shark dies. Essentially, this means that there are no complete skeletons of Megalodon in the fossil record to my knowledge. Obviously, a complete skeleton would be the best tool we could possibly use to understand Megalodon's individual body parts. But since we don't have that, our best option is to understand which living sharks would have had similar body plans or body shapes to Megalodon. And that is the best option available to us going forward. Now, when people think of large sharks that eat marine mammals, the first living shark that springs to mind is the great white shark. Indeed, we actually know that Megalodon was a lamniform shark, much like the great white, due to similarities in their teeth and vertebral centra fossils. In fact, people think they were so similar that, as I mentioned before, Megalodon was, for the longest time, considered Megalodon, the great white shark's direct ancestor, to the point where all previous reconstructions of Megalodon and even the tooth to total length calculations are based very heavily on the great white shark. But as I'm going to briefly show you to justify our personal uses of analogs, their relationship is actually a bit more complicated than that. Upon first glance, when you look at their teeth, they do appear to be quite similar. They're both quite large, triangular, and they're serrated, kind of like kitchen knives, which indicates that they were probably eating very similar things like large marine mammals. But there's actually several distinct differences between these teeth. For example, the Megalodon tooth has a clear dental band that is not present in the great white shark's tooth. Megalodon teeth are also noticeably thicker. And there was one particularly clever piece of work from 2006 that actually quantified the shape of the Megalodon teeth and was able to compare them in a morphal space. And what they found was, despite their similar appearances, Megalodon teeth don't actually overlap with the shape of great white shark teeth all that much at all. In gray there, it's kind of off on its own in the morphal space, while great white shark teeth are much more similar in shape to those of ancient mako sharks. And finally, when they put the serrations of the two teeth under a microscope, there were some clear differences there too. Megalodon serrations are finer and rounder, whereas those of great whites are quite jagged, triangular, and irregular. When you combine all of that evidence together, it strongly suggests that the great white did not evolve from Megalodon after all, as originally thought, and instead is much more likely to have evolved from ancient mako sharks, whereas Megalodon is part of its own extinct clade called the Megatooth family. Now, going forward into my work, this was both good and bad for us in how we chose our analogues for Megalodon. It was good because we had a better understanding of Megalodon's relationship with living sharks. But the bad news was now the only thing we have to go off of is that Megalodon is in order Lamniformes. And this is an order of sharks that contains 15 living species and very, very diverse species of that. If we go from the top to the bottom in this phylogeny here, our lamniform sharks included the goblin shark, the basking shark, the sand tiger shark, the porbigo and salmon sharks, the great white, 2 species of mako shark, 3 species of fresher shark, the megamouth shark, the crocodile shark, and 2 more species of sand shark. And there's been all sorts of hypotheses as to where Megalodon's family may lie in the lamniform tree of life and what its closest living relatives are. So how can we possibly work out which of these sharks are the best possible templates for Megalodon? Luckily, there is a way to do that, and we can do this without actually looking at any fossils. This is a technique called extant phylogenetic bracketing. It's a specialty of Mike Benton's, and what this means is we essentially take the traits that we know Megalodon had, those being the shape of its teeth, the macropredatory ecology, eating large prey like whales or marine mammals specifically in this case, and most importantly, that endothermic physiology I mentioned, the ability to control its inner body temperature. This is the most important trait we can use because it is so rare in sharks. In fact, it has only evolved in order Lamniformes. And if we analyze its evolutionary pathway and include fossil taxa, it suggested that this may have evolved just one single time in the Cretaceous, meaning that, oh no, the last common ancestor between Megalodon and the living mesothermic sharks may have been way back in the Cretaceous. That would still be their last common ancestor and would suggest that that shark gave rise to all the mesothermic sharks alive today. So when we consider which sharks in lamniform are mesothermic and eat marine mammals, not only does the great white meet this criteria, but so do all of its relatives. The 2 sharks at the top here from left to right are the long fin mako and the short fin mako shark, and the bottom left to right are the porbigo and the salmon shark. Because all of these sharks have the same basic ecology and the same mesothermic physiology, it means that they have actually been shaped into very similar body plans, living for very similar active lifestyles. And this is a lifestyle that Megalodon is inferred to have as well, meaning that while those sharks may not necessarily be Megalodon's closest living relatives, they probably are the best template for body plan we can use, as they've evolved very similar body shapes for the same basic traits that Megalodon had. So essentially, to go forward and get our body dimensions, we need to measure the individual body parts of these 5 living sharks. The simplest way to do that would be to go out to sea, fish these sharks out, and then measure those body parts. But there's some problems with doing that. I don't know how many of you have done masters in paleontology, but you get basically no funding for it. So it was way too expensive to do that. More importantly, far too time consuming. And lastly, somewhat morally questionable, because if you go out fishing sharks and you don't know what you're doing, you can really stress them out and possibly kill them. And that's not something we're interested in doing. So the easiest way for us to do this then was to actually gather a large collection of scaled digital images from scientific picture databases, such as the website FishBase, which is dedicated to documenting every living fish species, or Shark References, which gathers every single piece of scientific literature that has ever been recorded on sharks. From this, we can gather a large collection of 2D lateral images where the total length is either known or can be scaled against an object in the image, such as a ruler. And since we know the total length of the sharks from these 2D lateral images, we can very simply measure the individual body parts using ImageJ software. And from that, we can run a relationship between each body part against the known total length of these sharks, essentially allowing us to understand what proportion of each body part takes against total length. One of the coolest things we could also do was we can actually quantitatively capture the shape of various body parts using digital landmarks. And what this allows us to do is we can run them in a visualization geometric morphometric analyses in which we can visualize how the shapes of those body parts changes as total length increases. Since all of our analog sharks are mesothermic macropredators, just like Megalodon, we can therefore actually visualize what the shapes of these body parts might have looked like in an extreme total length like that of Megalodons. So what did we find? Well, when we put our individual body parts into graphs against total length, we got some interesting slope results that overlapped between all the species. And that indicates that each individual body part has a linear relationship with total length. But most importantly, if you look at the thick black lines there, they are very, very straight and diagonal. And this indicates something called isometry, which basically means that each of these individual body parts was growing at roughly the same rate as total length across all 5 of these sharks. And this makes our life much, much easier, because since our analog sharks have the same basic body plan and are all showing isometry, we can assume that it was the same in Megalodon and take the proportion of each body part, for example, dorsal fin height being about 10% the length of total length, and extrapolate that to Megalodon. When we looked at our shape analyses, we found that not only did our analog sharks occupy the same morphospace, but we found that as total length increases, larger sharks tend to have more robust heads for consuming larger prey, whereas the dorsal fins get taller and slightly narrower, which we think allows for steadier and possibly faster swimming, whereas the pectoral and especially the tail fins don't really change shape at all, meaning that these same basic shapes can be assumed in Megalodon. So when we take our results and apply them to a 16-meter Megalodon, we get a head of about 4.65 meters long, a dorsal fin some 1.62 meters tall, and a tail almost 4 meters high, amongst about 20 other individual body dimensions. For context, this means that a 16-meter Megalodon's head was about the same length as an average great white shark, and the dorsal fin was the same height as an average adult human being. Because we have all of these individual body dimensions, we have a much better understanding of Megalodon's entire body profile, meaning that we can enact a 2D artistic reconstruction of Megalodon, which was beautifully brought to life by Mr. Oliver Dimmoff, who was a classmate of mine at Bristol and is now doing his PhD at Cambridge. He is an extremely gifted paleo artist who did an absolutely incredible job with this reconstruction. And he is someone you should definitely Google to see some of his other artwork. This work formed the basis of my first ever scientific paper, which was published in Scientific Reports last September, and acts as a bridge to my next piece of work, which is a 3D reconstruction of Megalodon. Now, this will be a particularly interesting and juicy part of the talk to wrap us up, because it's not only utilizing actual fossils, but it's actually work that I'm still currently working on and that we are finalizing so that we can prepare to submit to a scientific journal. So what you guys are getting here is pretty exclusive and a nice peek into what I'm working in right now. While I'm going to be talking a lot about how we make the 3D model, we also hope to answer some ecological questions with this. So 2 questions I want you guys to think about as I go through this is, what was the biggest prey item that Megalodon could possibly eat? And finally, how many calories does a giant shark actually need to eat? So the 3D reconstruction was a project I got involved in right after I left Bristol, but it's actually been in the works for several years now. The masterminds behind this project are, of course, Dr. Catalina Pimiento, but also Professor John Hutchinson of the Royal Veterinary College in London. He is an American himself and is a world-leading expert on the locomotion and biomechanics of extinct taxa. He is actually the guy who can tell you how fast a T-Rex could run. So he's a very, very cool person to be working with. While this is a rather complicated undertaking, the aims of this project are again very straightforward. Firstly, we want to recreate the first 3D model of Megalodon using the best available fossils. Then we want to calculate body mass from the model, essentially providing the body mass of one individual Megalodon. And then we can use that body mass to estimate various ecological properties, such as its swim speed, its stomach volume, which will tell us what the biggest prey item it could eat was, and finally, its daily energy requirement, which will tell us how many calories it needed to eat. Now, as I mentioned before, Megalodon skeletons tend to decompose to the rest of the body, given that they're made out of cartilage, but very, very occasionally, you get a piece of backbone or vertebrae preserved in exceptional circumstances. There is, however, one absolutely remarkable fossil called IRSNB P9893, and this is a fossil from the Miocene of Belgium, where 141 of these vertebrae were preserved, and due to their similar texture and coloring, they actually came from the same individual shark. This incredible specimen was discovered in the 1860s and ever since has been stored at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels. Surprisingly, no one actually thought to examine this thing in detail until 1996. And this was a team led by Mike Gottfried, which compared this particular vertebral column against the skeletons of great white sharks. And much like how we extrapolate tooth size to total length in great whites, they took the diameter of the largest bone in the skeleton and compared that to total length in great white sharks so that they could extrapolate the same relationship to Megalodon using the biggest backbone vertebrae fossil in this specimen. From this, they calculated a size of 9.21 meters long, which is about the size of a late juvenile. However, this was based on an assumption that the great white is Megalodon's direct ancestor and had essentially the same skeletal structure, which we now know to not be the case. So this needs to be updated. And more importantly, no one has actually attempted to measure the entire reconstructed column before. There has been some recent work on this specimen where, much like in tree rings, they counted the growth rings on each of the vertebral fossils and found that this shark actually died at the age of 46. But they did not actually scrutinize the total length that was originally calculated. So it's something we need to update. And this was done based on the work of Jeanette Prelot, who is a PhD student in the University of Florida studying biomechanics. And first, what she did was she took 3D scans of every single fossil in this spine and reconstructed the entire column, accounting for centra that were missing in the column and the certain positions of specific fossils. And when she did this, I was able to scale it back to its original size based on the diameter of all the fossils. And when we measured the complete column, we found that this column was actually 11 meters long on its own. And this is almost 2 meters bigger than the original calculation of the entire shark. And this indicates that not only is our shark bigger than we originally thought, but it's actually clearly an adult shark, meaning that we might be dealing with a very, very big individual here. Now, unfortunately, teeth were not found associated with this spinal column. So to recreate our 3D model's mouth, we had to utilize teeth from elsewhere, and preferably an associated dentition from one single individual. Luckily, I was talking earlier about an associated dentition used by Victor Perez from the University of Florida. This is a specimen called UF311000. And this is essentially an associated dentition that was originally found in the Lee Creek mine in North Carolina. It was originally owned by renowned shark fossil collector Gordon Hubble, who has since generously donated it to the University of Florida, where it has been 3D scanned and it can act as the jaws for our model. But we don't have a skull of Megalodon, so we are forced to utilize a 3D scan of the skull of a great white shark, which was provided to us by Professor Stephen Rohr, who had originally used this skull to calculate bite force in great white sharks. And what we did was we took this skull and the teeth within it, and we actually scaled the teeth of our associated dentition into the jaws of this skull, meaning that while it is still a great white shark skull, it now contains Megalodon teeth within it. And this skull actually came with vertebrae preserved in it as well. So we could simply scale the skull down so that the size of its vertebrae matched the diameter of the vertebral column for Belgium. And this gives us our skeletal base model, which is the skull, the teeth, and the vertebral column. So all we really have to do here is simply reconstruct the flesh, and we have our 3D model. But again, we don't exactly have a time machine to go back and see what Megalodon's body or skin might have looked like. So we need to rely on an analog to fill in the gaps. And thankfully, one analog came to us from the KZN Shark Board in South Africa, who I was able to make contact with thanks to my work interning in South Africa way back when. And they obtained the body of a deceased great white shark and were able to 3D scan the entire body of the shark so they could provide it to us for our 3D model. So this is great. It means we can scale up this shark to our skeletal base model so we can recreate the flesh of the Megalodon. But one thing to keep in mind is that this is actually a juvenile great white shark at about 2.5 meters long. And larger sharks tend to get much bulkier, meaning that an adult Megalodon is probably not going to be the same basic shape as this skinny Malinky great white here. So to account for this, we simply reconstruct the flesh around this model and then adjust our model's bulk based on the 2D reconstruction you saw earlier. So this is the method we used to reconstruct our model. We used a software called Blender, which is a free software for modeling and animation. And it's a very, very simple technique that has been used by John Hutchinson around entire skeletons of T-Rex to recreate 3D models of those animals. What we do is we take octagonal hoops and we fit them tightly around the skeleton of our model, or in the case of the fins, around the fins of our great white scan, so we can fill in where those fins were. And once we have those hoops, we essentially fill them in, and that gives us a complete volumetric model of Megalodon and its flesh. What we can then do is combine that volume with the density of sharks to calculate the body mass of this animal. So with our completed model measured and then weighed, our final model came out to 15.93 meters long. And when we calculated body mass, we got an enormous 61.5 tons. And this is by far the heaviest individual shark ever calculated to human knowledge. So the juicy part that comes from this complete model is that we can use that enormous body mass to calculate its swim speed, its stomach volume, and its daily energy requirement. Again, we're going to have to rely on what's been calculated in living sharks because no one has ever seen a living megalodon swim or eat. Thankfully, previous work has scaled cruising speed against body mass in 26 shark species and has been tested against the recorded swim speeds of those species and found to be somewhat accurate. So if it's accurate for those living sharks, the parsimonious assumption would be that it's also accurate for Megalodon. So we can go ahead and use this very simple equation to do so. Stomach volume and daily energy requirement, however, are a bit more challenging because they have only ever been calculated in the great white shark to our knowledge, and this has been down to the work of David Burnvey and Jeremy Cliff. Their work has been paramount and very, very novel for calculating these specific properties, and we don't necessarily want to rely too heavily on the great white shark, but there are some benefits for using these particular equations. Firstly, the relationship between stomach volume and body mass is isometric, and this means they grow at very similar rates, much like our individual body dimensions in Megalodon, meaning that there isn't much risk in simply extrapolating the same relationship to Megalodon. And finally, daily energy requirement calculations rely very heavily on the fact that the great white is endothermic, but thankfully so is Megalodon, and therefore lived a similarly active lifestyle, so the same equation can be applied. And these are the results we have found so far. Our cruising speed for Megalodon was calculated to be about 1.39 meters per second, which is around 5 kilometers per hour. And this is quite a fast swimmer for a shark. This is not entirely surprising because endothermy actually elevates shark swim speed. We also see this in great whites and mako sharks. And this allows the shark to encounter more prey so it can consume more food. And indeed, when we compare this swim speed against a data set of about 30 living shark species, we find that on average, Megalodon was swimming faster than these living...
the Fossil Club meeting. There were actually 2 meetings tonight that conflicted.
You know that?
Okay, sorry guys. So they're actually faster than some of these living shark species. And this is interesting for a couple of different reasons, but when we dive deeper into the individual sharks from this data set, we find that some smaller great whites and makos could actually outswim Megalodon. And this too makes sense because, oh no, the shark is swimming quite fast. It's still an enormous animal and therefore likely had much greater drag. But this might also suggest that smaller sharks in the Pliocene that were also endothermic might have had competitive advantages over Megalodon by being able to swim faster and therefore quickly snatch prey. For stomach volume, we found sizes of between 7,000 and 10,000 liters for a 16-meter shark. To understand the relationship between this and the size of prey items, we took a list of masses and volumes from living organisms like great white sharks, dolphins, and killer whales, as many of their immediate ancestors were alive at the same time as Megalodon, and therefore could be used as appropriate proxies. And what we find is that a 16-meter shark of the size of our model could have easily consumed prey of up to 8 meters long, which is about the size of the biggest killer whale. Fossil evidence has suggested that Megalodon possibly targeted marine mammal colonies, and we think that as massive adults, Megalodons as big as our model might have actually avoided competitors by eating larger prey via predation or maybe scavenging. And finally, for daily energy requirement, our calculation came up to a result of over 98,000 calories per day. So that's a lot of food this animal needs to eat. And because it's endothermic, it likely needs much more abundant prey. However, what is particularly interesting is that the whales that this shark was eating, their blubber in their skin contains almost 7,000 calories per kilogram, meaning even eating just one rather medium-sized whale could probably fuel a megalodon for the entire day. But as we mentioned before, megalodons of this 16-meter model size might have been eating much larger prey to avoid competition. And this means they would have typically been consuming far more energy than required at a time. This is actually behavior you see in great whites today, which only need about 5,000 calories per day, but can consume up to 200,000. And the excessive energy they use is actually used to fuel long-distance migrations, sometimes across entire oceans. Therefore, we suggest Megalodon may well have been doing the same thing. And we're going to dive deeper into this in future work by the work of Rory Wilson, one of our colleagues who's working on this with us. So this is the work we've done so far, and there's still a wee bit more left to do. Firstly, we need to calculate prey encounter probability rate for the shark and figure out how much far this shark could migrate after consuming a full killer whale. And once we've done that, we can simply submit the paper. And all the faces you see here is everyone who has worked on this ongoing study so far and will be included as authors on the final paper. And that brings us up to the end of this talk, this rather long talk. So I'm going to leave you on just a quick set of conclusions. Firstly, Megalodon fossils have told us quite a lot about its ecology. There are a few issues of how we calculate its size, but we are forced to rely on modern day sharks due to bad skeletal preservation. And my work has found that a 16-meter Megalodon had a dorsal fin so as tall as an adult human being, and that body mass from a 3D reconstruction gives us insights into the ecology of this animal, that it could eat very large prey and possibly use excessive energy to fuel long-distance migration patterns. And thank you all very much for listening to this long ramble. I want to thank everyone in this slide for their various roles in my career, and I am more than happy to take any questions. And in case you want to take any notes of my references, this is them here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jack. Do you want to stop sharing? We can all come back together for some question time.
Oh, I see we've got some chats there.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so fascinating to get a sneak peek into science as it's happening. Oh, I don't know who was unmuted for that. We'll take some questions right now. We had one question earlier on in the chat box. Bill wanted to know if anybody has broken a megalodon's tooth to see if there's any non-mineralized fossilized material inside for DNA.
That is an excellent question. To my knowledge, nobody has attempted that. I don't think we've ever really found DNA preserved in fossils as far as I'm aware, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be attempted necessarily.
Okay. Bryn asked, how can you tell the mouth position of any given tooth?
Oh, that's a great question too. And there's actually some very subtle indications for that. As typically what I called upper anterior teeth or the upper middle teeth in the jaw tend to have quite a straight slant. So they're very straight and symmetrical, kind of like what you've got there, I can see in the chat there. Whereas lateral teeth further back tend to have a slight curve in their slant. It's quite subtle, but the trained eye can pick up on it.
And Doug, I think you mentioned that.
My name is Ethan. I like Megalodons and I'm 5.
That's wonderful. That's about the same age I was when I got into them.
And Donna wanted to know if the vertebrates found in Belgium have any teeth, and I think that you said that they did not have any teeth associated with them.
They have teeth, just none that have been confirmed to be associated with that same spinal column. it would have been great if they had done, because that would have made our life so much easier. Alas.
And Mason wants to know, could the same techniques be applied to other fossil landeds and odontids?
I think so, yes. And my understanding is it's already starting to be applied in some work that's being reviewed. I believe there's work on Angustidens, that's a nursery site in South Carolina, that they've tried to apply some of these same techniques to. I think it's Bobby Bosenecker who's working on this right now.
Bill says there has been DNA in large dinosaur bones.
That's something I need to look into, actually, because there's certainly been claims for DNA in dinosaur bones. I know that's disputed by some people, but it's not my level of expertise, so I would need to dive into it and have a look.
Yeah, he says go run them through an MRI to see if there's any goo inside. That's the technical term for DNA.
I like dinosaurs too.
When Donna wants to know, are there any nursery sites in Maryland or Virginia?
None that I know of. The nursery sites I'm aware of are Panama and Spain, and the nursery site in South Carolina is one of Megalodon's ancestors rather than Megalodon itself. But there's a paper from last year by my colleague Humberto Ferron, who discovered, I think it was 4 nursery sites, and that work looked into quite a lot of different sites. So there's probably a couple of North American sites among them.
And Charlotte wants to know, why did the Belgium fossilize and the others don't?
It's probably the right place at the right time and at completely exceptional circumstances. Like that Megalodon clearly died in just the right place to get preserved.
Here's a question for me. What is your hypothesis on the dying out of the Megalodon? Do you think it was a prey or being outmaneuvered by the great white?
I think it was a combination of multiple factors. I don't want to appear too biased because I'm very much in the field with my boss, Catalina, but I very much agree with her theories that it was probably down to biotic factors in which there was prey decline, habitat decline, and then that situation was just made worse by the fact that great whites came along and ate the same food.
Okay, anybody else have some more questions for Jack? You can raise your hand and I'll recognize you. You can put it in. Shannon, you want to show your tooth? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to see that.
Actually, it's my mom's computer that she put up with, that she put up for me and my dad, but I legit have a
Oh,
Megalodon
wow,
tooth, so.
very nice. Oh, wow, very nice.
So.
Where did you find that one?
My dad actually gave it to me. He bought it.
Okay.
Found it
So.
at a fossil store.
Well, you're going to need to come out on a fossil hunt with the Maryland Natural History Society of Maryland Fossil Club, and find some fossil clubs of your own. I know that Adam's come out there and found some teeth and a whole bunch of folks. Bill says in Maryland there will be a complete Mithras specimen.
Oh, that's cool. Because
including skin and teeth and vertebrate. It was on display at the Calvert Marine Museum.
Well, I guess I've really got to go to the Calvert Museum then when I can travel again. That's cool. I definitely want to see that if I can get there.
Yeah, and I think that you have an open invitation, Jack, to come to Maryland and go fossil hunting and go to the Calvert Marine Museum and down the Calvert Cliffs and find some cool things with us.
Oh, that'd be great. And so many like wonderful people that have contributed to Megalodon science have worked there, like Victor Perez, who's coming on in a couple of months, and Stephen Gottfried, who I mentioned in the talk. So those are two people I'd love to actually meet in person.
And as Jack mentioned and Mason put in here, in 2 months, our speaker for the Fossil Club will be Dr. Victor Perez. So you've heard about him, and now you'll actually get to see him and get the words from his actual mouth. So make sure that you are registered for that talk, and it's all going to be about fossil sharks. And Bill says you can get the data from Stephen Godfrey. It was scanned at Johns Hopkins. So there you go.
I have a question.
All right, go ahead.
I actually found a T-Rex claw.
This is not about T-Rex, it's about Megalodons. Oh, it's about Megalodons, not T-Rex.
I mean,
Do you have a question about Megalodon? No, okay. No question.
Okay, but next month is going to be Triceratops. So if you're into dinosaurs, come back next month to learn about Triceratops. Not the T-Rex, but a different dinosaur, one with 3 horns and a frilly neck.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
It's a herbivore that eats plants.
Okay. Any other questions for Jack?
I see there's a couple of mentions to the Cooper River. That was one of the first places I was aware of where you could find Megalodon teeth, naturally being the same name as my surname, and I was immediately wanting to go there. So one day, hopefully.
Yes, yeah. It looks like you can go on a diving trip with Bryn, so you're making some connections here.
As it happens, I don't know if any of you have know Jeff Maynard. I think he's from North Carolina. He's got like an artistic reconstructed jaw, I think in his house for his kids that I helped him work on. So somewhere in North Carolina, there's a jaw with my name on it somewhere that I've never seen. So,
well, Jack, thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation. Thank you not only for taking your time to share your knowledge and expertise, but thank you for all you're doing to move the scientific frontier and knowledge bar forward for us all. We're grateful for the work that you're putting in, and we hope that you will come and visit us in Maryland as soon as it's safe to do so. You have many friends in Maryland.
As soon as I'm allowed to, I'll be there.
Right. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us this evening to learn about Megalodon. I hope that you can go rent the movie and tell them how wrong that they were now and have the scientific knowledge to back it up. And I hope to see you all at other presentations, at field trips, and at the next meeting where we'll learn about research that's being done with the Triceratops squirrels. So thank you again. Mason, do you need to say anything?
For joining us, Jack, from all the way over in England at a very late hour, and for being one of the first people to respond to me when I asked all my scientist friends. So really, thank you. That was an awesome talk, and the Calvert Marine Museum would be happy to have you over at some point.
Oh, it'd be my pleasure to be there. Thanks, Mason.
All right, everybody, stay safe and stay curious, and we'll see you soon. Good night.
Thanks, guys.